moderator would be Dr. Ashwin Setia. And then we have a lecture by Dr. Kaushal Madan on the challenges in the management of HCC. So there are two related topics, and I hope that we'll have some fruitful discussion after each topic. So, Dr. Ashwini,
thank you.
With you now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Goenka, for giving me this opportunity and presenting our journal club this evening. And I personally think that we have come far from the days when we had hardly any treatment for unresectable HCCs. In fact, why unresectable? Even otherwise, we had limitations of size, we had limitations of number, even for the non-invasive part of treatment. Having said that, we have come a long way. And this, as Dr. Goenka just mentioned, is a very interesting development. And as is there in most other fields, we are now having biologicals and biosimilars, monoclonal antibodies in the treatment. And Dr. Arpit Bansal is going to today give us an overview and a discussion about this topic, which was published in NEJM, atezolizumab and bevacizumab in unresectable hepatocellular carcinoma. This is IM-BRAVE 150 trial. Over to you, without taking much time. Over to you, Arpit, please. The stage is all yours.
Thank you, sir. I'll just share my slide. Thank you, everyone. Good evening. I would like to thank National Board for giving me an opportunity to present this journal club. So I will be presenting the IM-BRAVE 150 trial, which was published in New England Journal of Medicine. It is atezolizumab plus bevacizumab in unresectable hepatocellular carcinoma. It was published on May 19, 2020. So hepatocellular carcinoma is the sixth commonest cancer and the fourth leading cause of cancer-related deaths worldwide. Most patients present with unresectable disease and they have a poor prognosis. Only 2 drugs have been approved as first-line systemic therapy for hepatocellular carcinoma before this trial. That was sorafenib in 2007 and lenvatinib in 2018. So the first drug that we had for hepatocellular carcinoma was sorafenib, which was published, the data for which was published in 2007 by the SHARP and the Asia Pacific trial. After that, there were a series of trials over a period of years, but all of them did not show any benefit. There was sunitinib, nintedanib, dovitinib. However, in 2018, there was lenvatinib via the REFLECT trial, which showed non-inferiority to sorafenib. And in 2018, the IM-BRAVE 150 trial was started. That was atezolizumab plus bevacizumab. In 2019, we had the results for that. And the trial Keynote 524, that is pembrolizumab and lenvatinib, is right now ongoing as a first-line therapy. So for the successful immunotherapeutic strategies, there are actually 4 key elements. First of all, like multi-kinase inhibitors like sorafenib, they can release the tumor antigens from the tumor, which act on the antigen-presenting cells, and these can induce T-cell response and induce cell death. Second option is via the cancer vaccines and adaptable cell therapies to increase the frequency of tumor-specific cytotoxic T cells, which could home into the tumor microenvironment and attack the tumor cells. The third therapy is via anti-angiogenesis agents, that is tumor microenvironment remodeling strategies. So they reduce the hypoxic and immunosuppressive microenvironment. And the fourth are checkpoint inhibitors. They block the exhaustion pathways, thus re-energizing the anti-tumor immune response. So sorafenib is a multi-kinase inhibitor, while bevacizumab is an anti-angiogenesis agent, and atezolizumab is a checkpoint inhibitor. Let's see the rationale for the combination of atezolizumab and bevacizumab. So what happens is there are proteins called programmed cell death 1. They are present on the cytotoxic T lymphocytes. They are basically inhibitory proteins that inhibit the immune response, and they promote self-tolerance by modulating the activity of cytotoxic T cells. Then there are PDL1, that is programmed death ligand 1 cell proteins. They are expressed by the cancer cells, and they act as an adaptive mechanism, and they act as a pro-tumorigenic factor. So what happens is when the PD1, PDL1 axis is formed, It is responsible for cancer immunoescape. This is the mechanism by which tumor cells escape their destruction by cytotoxic T lymphocytes. So what atezolizumab does is it selectively binds to PD-L1, thus preventing the PD-1, PD-L1 axis formation. And thus it reverses the T cell suppression, so the cytotoxic T lymphocytes can now attack the tumor cells. On this side, what happens is VEGF, that is vascular endothelial growth factor, it firstly promotes angiogenesis inside the tumor microenvironment. Also, it leads to stimulation of suppressive T cells, that is regulatory T cells, myeloid-derived suppressor cells, and tumor-associated macrophages. All of these cause immunosuppression, and it inhibits cytotoxic T lymphocytes and antigen-presenting cells. So what we want is inhibition of VEGF. Thus, bevacizumab, which is a monoclonal antibody, it targets VEGF, inhibits angiogenesis, and thus reverses the VEGF-mediated immunosuppression. Now coming to the study, the aim of the study was to determine the safety and efficacy of atezolizumab plus bevacizumab as compared with sorafenib in patients with unresectable HCC who had not previously received systemic therapy. The major inclusion criteria was patients should be 18 years or older, had locally advanced metastatic or unresectable HCC or both. Diagnosis had to be confirmed by either histological criteria or clinical features based on the ASLD criteria. For patients with cirrhosis. For patients without cirrhosis were also included in the trial, but they required histological confirmation. The patient should not have received prior systemic therapy for liver cancer, as we are testing it as a first-line agent. And the patient should have measurable disease, which is defined by the RECIST, that is response evaluation criteria in solid tumors. We'll be discussing RECIST criteria later. The disease should not be amenable to curative or local regional therapies. Thus, it should be unresectable HCC. And a performance status score of only 0 or 1 on the ECOG group scale was taken, and Child-Pugh A on the liver function scale. Child-Pugh B and C were not included. Patients should have adequate hematological and organ function. The major exclusion criteria was the presence of autoimmune disease, co-infection of hepatitis B and hepatitis C, or untreated or incompletely treated esophageal or gastric varices, which were at high risk for bleeding. So what is the RECIST? That is the response evaluation criteria in solid tumors. It defines the measurable disease, that is tumor lesions with the longest diameter with a minimum size of 10 mm by CT or MRI, or a 10 mm caliper measurement by clinical examination. Malignant lymph nodes are defined by 15 millimeters in the short axis when assessed by CT scan. And how is response defined by RECIST criteria? So there are 4 grades. One is complete response, that is disappearance of all lesions and pathological lymph nodes. P is partial response, that is more than 30% decrease in the SLD. SLD is the sum of the longest diameters. No new lesions and no progression of non-target lesions. SD is stable disease, that is no PR or no PD. And PD is progressive disease, that is more than 20% increase in the SLD compared to the smallest SLD in the study, or progression of non-target lesions or new lesions. Then let us discuss the ECOG performance scale as well, which is very important in HCC. So the ECOG 0 is a fully active individual. ECOG 1 is an individual who is limited in strenuous physical activity but is able to carry out his work. While grade 2 is a person who is up and about for more than 50% of the waking hours. Grade 3 is only capable of limited self-care, confined to bed or chair for more than 50% of the waking hours. Grade 4 is completely disabled, unable to take care of himself, and grade 5 is dead. So in this trial, it was a global, multi-center, open-label, phase 3 randomized trial. Patients were randomly assigned in a 2:1 ratio to receive atezolizumab plus bevacizumab or sorafenib. Atezolizumab-bevacizumab group received 1200 mg of atezolizumab plus 15 mg per kg of bevacizumab IV every 3 weeks, while sorafenib group received 400 mg sorafenib twice a day. Then these patients were stratified based on 4 parameters, either region, which included Asia, but it excluded Japan, or rest of the world. ECOG performance scale of 0 or 1, macrovascular invasion or extrahepatic spread, and baseline alpha-fetoprotein levels less than 400 or more than 400. Then the patients were randomized in a 2:1 group with atezolizumab and bevacizumab and sorafenib. And the treatment was continued until there was loss of clinical benefit, an acceptable toxicity, and survival follow-up was done. An advantage of this study was that high-risk patients were also included in this study. They were those that had tumor invasion of the main trunk of the portal vein or the portal vein branch contralateral to the primarily involved lobe, or bile duct invasion, or tumor occupancy of more than 50% of the liver. The endpoints were, primary endpoint was overall survival. That was the time from randomization to death from any cause. Progression-free survival, which was time from randomization to disease progression or death based on the RECIST criteria. And secondary endpoints were objective response rate. That was percentage of patients with a confirmed complete or partial response. Duration of response. That was time from first documented complete or partial response to disease progression or death. And time to deterioration of quality of life, physical functioning. Assessment was done by CT or MRI at baseline and every 6 months until week 54. After that, it was done at every 9 weeks. The assessment of incidence and severity of adverse events was done according to the National Cancer Institute Common Terminology Criteria for adverse events. And patient-reported outcomes were evaluated with the use of European Organization for Research and Treatment of Cancer Quality of Life questionnaire. And deterioration was defined as a decrease from the baseline of 10 points or more on the questionnaire, maintained for 2 consecutive assessments. So at the beginning of the study, it was decided that a sample size of 480 patients targeting 312 deaths would provide a 80% power to detect a hazard ratio of 0.71, which would have favored atezolizumab plus bevacizumab. Hazard ratios for disease progression or death were estimated with a stratified Cox proportional hazards model. And overall survival and progression-free survival were assessed by Kaplan-Meier analysis. Response rates were compared between the treatment groups with a stratified Cochrane-Mantel Hensel test, because there were different strata in this which were divided. Randomization was based on 4 strata. So the period of enrollment in this study was from March 15, 2018 to January 30, 2019. A total of 501 patients spreading over 17 countries were assigned, which included patients from Asia, Japan. Japan was in a separate group, Australia, Europe, and America. Atezolizumab plus bevacizumab received 2/3 of the patients, 336 patients, and sorafenib was given to 165 patients. Now, among the two groups, the baseline characteristics were generally well balanced. The median age in atezolizumab bevacizumab was 56 to 71, and the other group 59 to 71. 82 to 83% of the population were male, and it was evenly divided in the geographical distribution as well. That Asia received 40%, and rest of the world was 60%. Another thing was that BCLC, most of them were BCLC stage C, that were around 82% of the people. Alpha-fetoprotein more than 900 was seen in only 38% individuals. And varices were present at baseline in approximately 26% of both the groups. The date of clinical data cutoff was August 29, 2019. Median duration of follow-up till then had been 8.6 months, 8.9 months in the atezolizumab group and 8.1 months in the sorafenib group. In this, we saw that the overall survival was significantly longer with the atezolizumab group. In the study, 96 patients in the atezolizumab bevacizumab group died and 65 in the sorafenib group died. But the percentage of people dying in the sorafenib group was 39.4%. The stratified hazard ratio for death was 0.58 and the p-value was significant at 0.001. So the estimated rates of survival with atezolizumab bevacizumab group was 84.8% at 6 months and 67.2% at 12 months, which were both higher than the sorafenib group, which was 72.2% and 54.6%. The progression-free survival were also significantly longer with the atezolizumab bevacizumab group. In this, we saw that 197 patients, that was 58.6%, receiving atezolizumab bevacizumab, while 66% of the sorafenib group had disease progression or death. The median progression-free survival was around 2.5 months higher in the atezolizumab bevacizumab group, 6.8 versus 4.3%, and the p-value was significant of less than 0.001. So progression-free survival at 6 months, 54.5% of the atezolizumab group had progression-free survival at 6 months, while sorafenib had 37.2%. Now coming to the secondary efficacy outcomes, it was seen that the overall survival benefit and progression-free survival benefit was consistent across all the clinically relevant subgroups. The confirmed objective response was 27.2% in the atezolizumab group and 11.9% in the sorafenib group. On the other side is the M-RECIST criteria, which is actually specific for hepatocellular carcinoma. So in that also we saw that the objective response was higher in the atezolizumab group with a difference of 19.9%. The complete response, that is complete removal of the disease, was seen in atezolizumab bevacizumab group of 5.5%, but there were no patients of this complete response in sorafenib group. Then disease control rate, that is the sum of confirmed objective response plus stable disease, was also higher, 73.6 versus 55.3%. Then the quality of life, median time to deterioration with atezolizumab bevacizumab group was 11.2 months, while in sorafenib group it was 3.6 months. So the patients had approximately a 7.5 to 8 months better quality of life. Now comparing the adverse event safety data. So adverse events in both the groups were reported of any kind were reported by at least 98.2 to 98.7, which is very high. However, grade 5 events, which are fatal, were reported in 4.6% patients of atezolizumab group and 5.8 in the sorafenib group. Adverse events which led to withdrawal from any of the trial group. Adverse events leading to withdrawal from any of the trial group was 15.5% in the atezolizumab group and 10% in the sorafenib group. And in the atezolizumab bevacizumab, I would like to tell that if the patient had a lot of side effects from one drug, the other drug could still be continued, and it was all dependent on the operator. The grade 5 events that were seen in the atezolizumab bevacizumab group included GI hemorrhage, pneumonia, empyema, gastric ulcer perforation, abnormal liver functions, liver injury, multi-organ dysfunction, esophageal variceal hemorrhage, subarachnoid hemorrhage, respiratory distress, sepsis, and cardiac arrest. In the sorafenib group, the grade 5 events included death in 2 patients, liver cirrhosis in 2 patients, cardiac arrest, cardiac failure, and hepatitis E and peritoneal hemorrhage in 1 patient each. So the most common grade 3 or 4 event with atezolizumab bevacizumab group was hypertension. Now hypertension as a side effect is very consistent with bevacizumab. Because bevacizumab has been always known to cause hypertension as a major side effect. So the incidence of hypertension of any grade was around 30% in this group, while it was 24% in the sorafenib group. Then AST increase was around 20% in the atezolizumab group, while 16% in the sorafenib group. And infusion-related reactions were definitely higher in the atezolizumab group, 11.2% versus 0 in the sorafenib, because it was an oral drug. Then palmoplantar erythrodysesthesia syndrome, which has always been seen in the sorafenib, was seen in 48% of the patients of sorafenib. Now, after 1 year after the initial trial had ended, they again published a series of data in which they showed that the overall survival with atezolizumab group was 19.2 months, while in the sorafenib group was 13.4 months, and progression-free survival had a difference of 2.5 months. So even on follow-up, there has been a significant improvement in overall survival. So IMBRAVE 150 trial has shown that there is significantly better overall survival and progression-free survival outcomes with atezolizumab plus bevacizumab compared with sorafenib. Significantly longer overall survival, there are 2.5 month increase in the median progression-free survival, 41% decrease in the hazard of disease progression or death, and there is a superior response rate of around 16%, that is 27.3 versus 11.9. 88% of patients who had a response, whether it was complete or partial, they continued to have a response at 6 months. Also in the atezolizumab bevacizumab group, the median time for deterioration quality of life and functioning was markedly longer than the median progression-free survival. 15% patients in the atezolizumab group discontinued treatment owing to adverse events, compared with 10% in the sorafenib group, and GI disorders were the most common reason for discontinuation. The incidence of upper GI bleeding, which is a side effect of bevacizumab, was 7%. There have been previous studies of single agent checkpoint inhibitors, and they have failed to show survival benefit with HCC. In the randomized portion of phase 1b study of 030140, there was no benefit with the monotherapy atezolizumab. However, there was significantly better progression-free survival outcomes with atezolizumab plus bevacizumab. So when monotherapy trials of both these drugs have been done, it has shown that there have been no significant better outcome. However, the combination has shown to be better. So I've compared the three landmark first-line agent trials for the overall survival and adverse events. So in the SHARP trial, sorafenib was compared with placebo, which showed an overall survival of 10.7 months. In the REFLECT trial, lenvatinib was compared with sorafenib and showed an overall survival of 13.6 months. The atezolizumab bevacizumab group on follow-up has shown an overall survival of 19.2 months. So this drug has shown the best overall survival in all the first-line agents. Adverse events, however, are also higher with the atezolizumab bevacizumab group. Those are 15.5% and are lowest with lenvatinib. The stance of this study was that it was a randomized controlled trial with an intention to treat analysis, and it included high-risk patients from a tumor invasion perspective. And the control was sorafenib, which was a current gold standard. But the limitations are that it was an open-label design. There was no blinding. It included only population with preserved liver function, child A, and low risk of variceal bleeding. It did not include child B or C because they said that they already have a higher risk of mortality. And the safety of the combination in a broader population still needs further study. On conclusion, treatment with atezolizumab plus bevacizumab has been associated with significantly better overall survival and progression-free survival outcomes than sorafenib. Serious toxic effects have been noted in 38% of the patients who received the combination. However, none of the toxic effects have been unexpected. And the combination therapy has also related in a longer time to deterioration of patient-reported quality of life. In the future, we would like that there will be tissue or blood-based biomarker analysis so that we can determine which patient would benefit most from this therapy. The predictive value of PD-L1 status has shown efficacy in the case of renal cell carcinoma. However, in the case of HCC, it has not shown the efficacy to determine the efficacy of PD-L1 and PD-1 inhibitors. And many ongoing studies of HCC are testing combinations of other immune checkpoint inhibitors and anti-angiogenesis agents. So some of the clinical trials currently ongoing, the result will be probably out in 2 or 3 years. So the most important trial is Cosmic 312, which is cabozantinib and atezolizumab, and on the other hand, compared to sorafenib. This is for a first-line drug. Then LEAP 002 is comparing lenvatinib and pembrolizumab. Himalaya is comparing durvalumab and tremelimumab. While Renovate trial is another important trial, which is comparing regorafenib plus nivolumab, and on the other hand, regorafenib plus pembrolizumab. Also, nowadays, there are other ongoing trials which are comparing these therapies with TACE for treatment of loco-regional disease. So, LEAP 012 is testing for lenvatinib plus pembrolizumab plus TACE, and on the other hand, TACE. Also, there's this ABC HCC trial that I would like to highlight. That is again the combination of atezolizumab plus bevacizumab, and it is being compared to TACE, with the primary endpoint being time to failure of treatment strategy as a first-line drug. Other drug is Reno-TACE, that is regorafenib and nivolumab, and is comparing with TACE. So that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, Dr. Ashwin, you have any comment to make? I have 1 or 2 questions for Arpit. I think this article was published almost 1.5 years from now and has really generated a lot of interest. And I was impressed by the follow-up data which you presented, and I was not aware of it. So this follow-up data has been published where? Can you tell us where was the follow-up data of a longer follow-up was published?
So Dr. Richard Finn has published the follow-up data in a conference. It was an oncology conference that he published it last year.
Okay, all right. So I think the obvious question which is there on the from the participant also is that this is on one side we are looking at advanced disease, and the second side we have said your list also talked about BCLC grade 1, grade 8. So these are actually not advanced cases, isn't it?
Yes, sir. Sir, actually, unresectable HCC can be either patient factors or could be tumor factors.
So you are talking about these are performance status wise, they are poor, and that's why they've been included?
Yes, sir. Either the performance status was poor or the tumor had either performance status or even if the patients have refused for surgery. So they will also be counted as unresectable HCC.
So I think this second part is agreeable that the patient may refuse the surgery, but if once the performance status goes bad, it automatically goes from BCLC grade A to maybe B and C. So
Yes,
that cannot be the reason. So this may be just exclusion. The other point is that we are looking at a subgroup where the disease is advanced, but the liver functions are preserved. So we are talking of child's A.
Child's A we are doing that.
Child screen, which is again a selective group.
Yes, sir.
So maybe we can hear from Ashwini and Dr. Kaushal Madan as to what percentage of patients in our practice have preserved liver function yet advanced liver disease in terms of volume of the tumor or extrahepatic spread.
I would not be able to put my finger on the exact percentage, but I think there are several patients who we see that the liver function is still preserved, and they meet with the criteria of being unresectable. Having said that, and when there is advanced cirrhosis, because here in this particular subgroup, there were patients who were selected without cirrhosis also. Having said that, the advanced cirrhosis, we have deterioration of liver function along with that. I don't know what Kaushal has to say about that.
So I think I'll present that data in my talk, that almost 50% of patients are child's B or C when they present with either early stage HCC or intermediate stage HCC. So this was one point which was raised by Dr. Goenka. And second was patients being child's A but having advanced HCC. I think about 1/5 of patients would be like this, but not very many.
So I understand in this study it was a very selected group, but do we have any data? Because we are very worried about patients who are advanced disease, intermediate or advanced disease, and abnormal liver function. So they are child's B, child C, as well as extrahepatic disease or advanced disease in terms of volume. There we have very limited techniques for treating. So we do put them on sorafenib, but I'm not a big follower of sorafenib. I don't find magical results. And if you give the proper dose, we find a lot of side effects.
I agree, sir. I think, again, I'll talk, because my talk is on challenges, I'll talk about this. But just to answer your issue of sorafenib, 80% of our patients are not able to tolerate, at least in India, are not able to tolerate the full doses. Those who do continue sorafenib are only in half or 1/4 doses. But it has been seen that those who do continue will have some kind of a response. That's one. Second, most of us have shifted from using sorafenib to lenvatinib, because lenvatinib is associated with very minimal side effects, or at least those side effects are not debilitating as they were with sorafenib. So with lenvatinib, we've had good experience. Patients who respond well to lenvatinib, sometimes their tumors almost, they reduce by half or almost disappear in some patients.
So, as an extension to what Kaushal said, what this study is underlining or underscoring is the fact that, okay, there is survival benefit, there is disease progression, which is slower. But what it hides or what it doesn't show is what is the quality of life. You see, we are sitting the quality of life with epoch. But the fact remains that how many of them had tolerated these two drugs together without suffering the side effects? And what, we have progression of the disease, or we have stopped the progression of the disease, and we have longevity, which is increased. But what about the quality of life? I really do not know whether we have other objective criteria other than what has been described as far as these adverse side effects are concerned, not adverse events alone, but adverse side effects are concerned.
Arpit, you have an answer to that?
So the quality of life in this, it was the European ECOG questionnaire, quality of life questionnaire, but it was self-filled by the patient. They did not take it for the quality of life. They and a base point of decrease of 10 or more points was decrease decided to be deterioration in the quality of life. The
So the
adverse
other issue which I wanted to be clear, if you can tell me, is that what was the duration of therapy in the active group, and what is the cost factor if we look at the cost in our setting? I suppose Roche is marketing this combination. So what's the cost per dose? We have to understand that we have to repeat this dose every 2 to 3 weeks.
So I checked
So
the
what is the end point?
so I checked the cost for it. Atezolizumab costs around 4 lakh rupees per injection, while bevacizumab is around 28,000 rupees per injection. It is given in a 3-weekly dose, so it will cost. That is for bevacizumab is for 100 mg, 15 mg per kg. So it will cost around 6 lakhs per
Session of 3 weeks.
per session, sir. Because single injection of atezolizumab is for 4 lakhs.
And so you go on giving it till the patient tolerates, or
Yes.
what is the end point?
So the end point is either till survival, till the patient is surviving, or any side effect which compels us to discontinue it.
So the only thing is that I would like to add that Roche company possibly has this helping thing that you buy one dose and they give 2 doses free. Something like that is being worked out. So that may possibly reduce the cost some extent.
Right.
Buy one, get one free. That's what they said the last time I met them. So
I think we have overstepped the time by 2 minutes. So Ashwin, should we move on to the second presentation?
yes, please. Yes, please. Thank you very much.
I have the pleasure of requesting Kaushal Madan, who is a hardcore hepatologist and has been the secretary of our society, national body, very, very active, both from the academic point of view as well as the research point of view. So happy to have you, Kaushal, here, and look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, sir. Are my slides visible?
Yes.
Yeah. So thanks to you and thanks to NBE for inviting our team to make the presentations. And I must congratulate Arpit. I think he did a wonderful job presenting this and answering taking forward the discussion. So I think most of the points which were raised during the discussion possibly will get answered here, or at least we can ponder over them. So HCC current treatment and challenges specifically related to our part of the world. So we all know that hepatocellular carcinoma is the sixth most common solid organ cancer worldwide. It is also the fourth leading cause of cancer-related deaths. As hepatologists, possibly many of us would not be aware of these figures. Maybe the oncologists were more well versed with this status of hepatocellular carcinoma than hepatologists, although we keep on encountering these tumors left, right, and center. So this is the most frequently, most popularly used staging for HCC, especially by the hepatologist and gastroenterologist. I know the oncologists possibly use a different kind of staging, but we, since we know that treating HCC involves not only the tumor size or tumor bulk or tumor spread, but also the functional status as well as the functional status of the liver, which has a bearing on the outcome. So based on that, it has 5 stages: stage 0, A, B, C, and stage D, where stage D is child C status or PST4-5. And when we talk of advanced cancer, when we talk of challenges in advanced cancer, it involves the intermediate and the advanced stage, the intermediate stage B or stage C. Linked to it are the therapies. So curative forms of therapy in stage 0 and stage A, that is RFA, resection, SBRT or liver transplant, and palliative forms of therapy, mainly TACE, transarterial radioembolization, SBRT, or now multi-kinase inhibitors and immunotherapy for advanced stage or intermediate stage HCC. So these are the ASCO guidelines, and most other guidelines also use this algorithm. So we are also aware of the BCLC 22 update, which was recently published this month itself, where again, they have also agreed that the first line treatment is atezolizumab plus bevacizumab based on the NEJM study, which Arpit just published. And where that is not possible, sorafenib or lenvatinib still remain the first line therapy. followed by second line therapy after the patient has progressed on first line or is intolerable to the first line. And these are either TKIs or atezolizumab if it has not been used earlier, or, or ramucirumab in those who have alpha fetoprotein more than 400. And the other immune checkpoint inhibitors or immune checkpoint blockers, whatever you may want to call them. So coming to the challenges. So the first and foremost challenge, although we have been talking about these new drugs, the systemic therapies, the TKIs, the immune checkpoint blockers, their combinations, but still the most important point to remember is that there are less than optimal response rates for intermediate and advanced HCC. Let's look at the study on TARE. This was published as early as 2008. 108 unresectable HCCs treated with intra-arterial deuterium. 42% although had a complete or partial response. Then they divided the patients into those who had no portal vein tumor thrombus, branched vein portal vein thrombus, and main portal vein tumor thrombus. And look at this. Very dismal results. 4.5 months median survival for patients who had main portal vein tumor thrombus. So this particular therapy was touted to be useful for patients with portal vein tumor thrombus, and in that very group, you have very poor response rates. So this group for which this therapy was instituted is associated with poor response rate. Another study, 291 patients with HCC, 526 sessions of TARE, child's A median survival 17.2 months, child's B only 7.7 months. And look at this, portal vein tumor thrombus in child's B patients, only 5.6 months of median survival. So very expensive therapy. It costs somewhere about 12 lakh for each session, and it gives you only 5.6 months in CTP-B. Let's talk about immunotherapy. A lot has been said about immunotherapy. This study, the nivolumab checkmate 459, where nivolumab was compared with sorafenib as first line, and there was no difference. So it was a failed study. Nivolumab did not have advantage. Monotherapy with nivolumab did not have advantage over sorafenib alone. Second, pembrolizumab, another PD-1, keynote 240, patients who had progressed or intolerant to sorafenib were given either pembrolizumab or placebo. And although numerically pembrolizumab did show advantage over placebo, but it did not reach pre-specified significance criteria for primary outcome. Again, a failed therapy. So much about immunotherapy, but look at the response rates. Second, in the same breath, before I move forward, I'll also talk about the atezolizumab bevacizumab study, which Arpit talked about. Although I totally agree that the response rates almost doubled as compared to the comparator group, that is sorafenib, but still less than 50% of patients responded. So you are giving a very expensive therapy with response rate restricted to about 40-45% patients, and that too not complete responses. So less than optimal responses is one of the major challenges. Second, toxicity with first line and second line therapies. You're all well aware of what sorafenib does to your patient. This is just a real life study called the Gideon study, which showed that the proportion of grade 3 or more adverse events which required discontinuation ranged from 17% to 21%. This is real life data from all over the world, where India also constituted small amount of patients, small proportion of patients. But this is not what our experiences in real life. We just had a discussion with Dr. Goenka about this some few minutes back, that almost 80% of our patients are not able to tolerate full doses of sorafenib. Most of them will either discontinue or will reduce the the dose of sorafenib just in order to continue. Okay, let's move to regorafenib, which is the second line after sorafenib. Look at this, 52% patient, this is their own data, 52% patient had any grades of hand and foot syndrome. And they even say that patients who do have hand and foot syndrome their survival is better than those who do not develop hand and foot syndrome. So first you develop a significant toxicity, only then you have a response. And for regorafenib, they say that if sorafenib side effects is heat, then regorafenib side effects are fire. So you have to go through fire to be able to have a good response. What kind of therapy is this? Let's look at immune checkpoint inhibitors and their side effects. The most important, since they increase the immune response to the tumor, they also increase the immune response in the body in general. So they are associated with autoimmune adverse events, which are most commonly seen with anti-CTLA4 antibodies and minimum with anti-PD-L1 antibodies. So this is autoimmune hepatitis or autoimmune or immune mediated rise in liver enzymes. So these are percentage of patients in ALT increased all grades, almost 15 to 20% patients will develop it, and more than equal to grade 3, 4% to 10% patients will develop this. And not only liver, they are associated with autoimmune adverse events in other organs as well, most notably GI. So patients who have inflammatory bowel disease will have a flare. If you put these patients on immune checkpoint blockers, and there can be skin toxicity, endocrinology related toxicity, endocrine organs, specifically thyroid, and lung fibrosis. So all the or interstitial pneumonias. So all these are adverse events associated with immune checkpoint blockers. And adverse event very unique to immune checkpoint blockers is hyperprogressive disease. So it has been shown in patients receiving nivolumab or pembrolizumab that 8% patients had an accelerated progression after starting these patients on this therapy. And not only HCC, other forms of cancers also have developed hyperprogressive disease with immune checkpoint blockers. The third important thing is that most of these results based on which the studies based on which we start using these drugs are applicable only in select group of patients. And Dr. Goenka raised this issue during the discussion. Look at this SHARP trial based on which sorafenib got approval. 96% patients were child's A. None of them were of child C, some child's B. And when they looked at the real life data, the Gideon study, which included more than 3,000 patients, look at the response rates or median overall survival in child's B or child C group. Child B 5.2 months, child C 2.6 months. What are we trying to achieve with such a toxic therapy being given in child's B and C? So most of the results, most of the benefit is in child's A group. Look at this REFLECT trial based on which lenvatinib got approval, lenvatinib versus sorafenib. This 100% patient child's A. So we are using these results, but these results are applicable only in child's A patients. So unless you have real life data on use of these drugs in child's B or child C, it's very difficult to say how they will work. So this is what the real life data is. This is the data which we published when we were in AIMS, 324 patients, and almost 50% patients were child B or child C with HCC when they presented to us. So only 50% patients will be eligible to be used to be benefited from these kinds of therapies. Arpit did talk about this lack of biomarkers for response to patients who have been given PD-1 or PD-L1. So intuitively speaking, since they are PD-1, PD-L1 blockers, the expression of PD-1, PD-L1 in the tumor tissue can be used as a biomarker for response, but that's not true for HCC. That's true for all other solid tumors where this is being used. Immune checkpoint blockers are being used. So if you look at this particular study of nivolumab, phase 2 trial, they looked at the PD-L1 staining, more than 1% tumor cells positive for PD-L1, less than 1% tumor cells positive for PD-L1, response rates similar, not statistically different. Another study of pembrolizumab, phase 2, 52 patients had tumor PD-L1 expression data available. So tumor proportion score more than 1%, tumor proportion score less than 1%. Overall response rate not statistically different between the two groups. So it did not matter whether PD1 or PDL1 expression was high or low in these tumors. So there is lack of biomarkers which might predict response to these therapies. So only a fraction of the patient will respond, but you will keep on giving therapies to other patients who were not destined to response, and you will waste a lot of finances in these particular patients. And that brings me to the issue of cost. So we talked about this. Each session of TARE costs about 12 lakh rupees. And if you look at the unsubsidized rates of nivolumab, monthly cost about 4 lakhs, pembrolizumab about 4 lakhs, monthly cost of atezolizumab is about 3 lakhs. These are unsubsidized. We did talk about whether the company will subsidize, then it comes to around just within 2 lakhs. And that is not all. These therapies are to go on continuously either till the patient dies or has a progression of disease or has a complete response. And we've seen that complete response occurs in less than 5% patients. So this is a huge cost which the patients have to incur when they use these therapies. So there was a meeting yesterday also, and some oncologist used the term financial toxicity. So financial toxicity is also a side effect of these particular drugs. This is a study from India, where they looked at cost effectiveness of sorafenib using a Markov model, and they found that the incremental cost of more than $7,800 for the use of sorafenib to gain per quali gain with sorafenib use, which is huge. And finally, I think this is the most important thing. I don't know how many oncologists or interventional radiologists are attending this event, but this is a very important issue. HCC is a unique tumor, different from other forms of tumor, where not only the tumor characteristics matter in terms of affecting survival, but cirrhosis, its complications like hepatic encephalopathy, portal hypertension, variceal bleeding, the virus, the HBV, HCV, all have to be controlled. I've seen many patients, they would be put on bevacizumab, which is an anti-angiogenic, and patients will land up with bleed, and the oncologist would not even have done an endoscopy before starting these patients on anti-VEGF. So it is a tumor which involves taking care of not only the tumor but other aspects also, and we have to work as a team. So you have this particular cartoon or diagram, whatever you want to call it, appears asymmetrical or incongruous, because that is what I want to highlight. The interaction between the hepatologist, interventional radiologist, the oncologist, and the liver oncosurgeon is incongruous to the best. And add to it the new therapy in the form of radiotherapy. You have 5 players who will work independently and not come together to give benefit to the patient. And this is one challenge which we must all try to overcome and work as a group when we are trying to treat these patients of HCC. I've always tried, but have miserably failed whenever I've tried to have a tumor board for HCC. I don't know why nobody wants to have a tumor board for HCC. Everyone wants to treat HCC on their own. And finally, new therapy, new challenges. This was the study presented by Arpit, which was a combination of atezo and beva. Atezo is immune checkpoint blocker, anti-PD-L1, and bevacizumab is anti-VEGF. We all know that NASH is going to be the most common cause of liver cancers in future. This is a study from US which has predicted 130% rise in NASH-related HCC by 2030. So most of the HCCs which we would be treating would be NASH. But look at this. NASH reshapes immune microenvironment in the tumor. It reduces the anti-tumor CD4 T cells, making them resistant to the use of immune checkpoint blockers. This was a study published in Nature which showed that the CD4 and CD4 by CD8 ratio was significantly lower in the NASH patients, NASH tumors, as compared to the viral tumor, suggesting that these may be resistant to immune checkpoint blockers. And this is a study just presented recently just come up in Nature in 2021, in which they did a meta-analysis of 1,600 patients from the major phase 3 trials of immune checkpoint blockers. They first looked at the non-viral HCC and the viral HCC. So while in viral HCC, the response favored the use of immunotherapy, but in non-viral HCC, which was mainly constituted by NAFLD, there was no response. And then they looked at specifically NAFLD, and they found that in two validation cohorts, 130 patients, 118 patients, patients who had NAFLD had a very poor response rate to immune checkpoint blockers as compared to other etiologies in both the cohorts, which is a major finding and published in Nature. And I'm going to use a very provocative statement soon. So, second, obesity. So, obesity is the most common risk factor, most important risk factor for NASH. So, obesity leads to resistance to bevacizumab. We are talking about atezo plus bevacizumab. Bevacizumab treatment in obese mice were associated with larger tumors. Just concentrate on blue line and the orange line. So, obese mice had larger tumors even when they were treated with bevacizumab, whereas lean mice had good tumor response. And this tumor response, this blockade could be reversed with pre-treatment with IL-6. So the provocative statement which I want to make is that non-alcoholic steatohepatitis related HCCs in obese patients may prove in future to be a contraindication to the use of immune checkpoint blockers. Many people are not going to like this statement. So to summarize, HCC contributes to a significant cancer burden worldwide. HCC management is beyond just the tumor. Multidisciplinary approach is essential to provide maximum benefit to the patient. These are the multiple challenges beyond which we have to go in order to provide benefit to these patients. These are poor response rates to systemic therapy. They are prohibitive costs or financial toxicity, unacceptable adverse events, results applicable only to a select group, whereas in real life world, we encounter a different kind of subgroup of these patients. Lack of biomarkers, although in futures, biomarkers like Wnt beta-catenin in the tumor or TGF beta levels may be used as biomarkers for response to these therapies, and a huge burden of unfavorable etiologies like NASH. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kaushal. I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions on the topic. You raised very, very salient, important points. So let me just take up the question which is there already. What about primary prevention of HCC and cirrhosis, and why don't public awareness programs are more actively pursued? Before you answer that, I think the studies from Taiwan and other places did show that some patients, if you follow up hepatitis B patients, and then the risk of HCC and the mortality of HCC reduces. But I think there are not much data on cirrhotic patients, whether cirrhotic by themselves when they are followed up. This study was primarily on hepatitis B, but we do not have data on cirrhotic and whether doing a surveillance program in that actually has a proper impact. So what's your point on that?
So I agree, the data from Taiwan, I think the most important primary prevention measure is to give hepatitis B vaccine. So I think in that sense, we are already on that path where hepatitis B is part of the universal, hepatitis B vaccine is part of the universal immunization program. And it was beneficial in Taiwan because they have a very high incidence of hepatitis B. To be able to have an effect in our country, it is possibly going to take a few more decades when we can say that vaccine did have a useful effect. Second, there is data, although mainly hospital-based studies, which suggest that patients of cirrhosis have about 1% risk of developing cancer, or maybe even less than what has been described from the Western countries. But we need to have population-based studies in cirrhotics to be able to say that what is the incidence. Third, I agree, most of the tumors which we detect are already in an advanced stage, or the cirrhosis is an advanced stage. So we are not able to treat them very effectively. So that is also a big, which I should have mentioned in the challenges. is a big challenge in detecting these patients early at a stage where either the tumor is treatable or the disease itself is treatable.
So I think, Kaushal, one more issue which I have noted is that we have a plethora of ultrasonologists. And to do a proper ultrasound to pick up small lesions in a background of cirrhosis is also a challenge. So I think that is something where we sometimes ultrasound misses it. And so over dependent on ultrasound, which is technically sometimes demanding in these patients who have irregular surface of the liver, echogenicity is altered, there may be nodules which are already there, sometimes may be challenging. And we know the limitation of alpha fetoprotein. So I think we do not, unless we do MRI or maybe a CT scan on a regular basis, which is a challenge to do, we may be missing, even if we are following the protocol of doing 6 monthly ultrasound. One more comment I would want from you is that your initial slide, I was a little surprised when you talked about SBRT being curative in the early stage. I thought SBRT is primarily used for advanced diseases. So I was surprised. So what data do we have that we can use SBRT in the early stage? I would also strongly agree with you that I have also miserably failed to have a multidisciplinary approach to this. I think whoever gets the patient treats the patient, unfortunately. So I think what about SBRT and what about so-called proton therapy? Do we have any role for proton therapy in the treatment of HCC?
Right. So regarding SBRT, so now there are, in fact, only yesterday in the single theme meeting, Dr. Hollinger probably presented controlled trial of SBRT versus RFA for small tumors. So RFable tumors, they were either given RFA or given the SBRT, and the response rates of SBRT were similar to RFA in terms of complete ablation and with similar side effects. And the advantage of proton beam therapy is that it leads to a higher dose localized to more in and around the tumor and salvaging the rest of the liver. And it also has shown significant cure rates for early HCCs, even intermediate HCCs also. And although not large series, but there have been case series which suggest that even intermediate stage HCC which have portal vein tumor thrombus, if you do either TARE or SBRT, take care of their portal vein thrombus, provided the liver function is good, some of them can even be downstage to a stage of liver transplant where they can be offered liver transplants.
So is there any explanation, Kaushal, for PDL1 expression being not deciding when we talk about the drugs being mainly acting through that and PDL1 expression is not correlating with the response?
The reason for that is not clear, and it's only a phenomenon in HCC, but I agree, it's very early data, only small number of patients. The first study was about in 20-25 patients, the second study was in 52 patients. So maybe once we collect more data, we'll be able to more confidently say whether that's true or not.
So there's a question from one of the attendees is, what do we do if bilirubin starts increasing if the patient is on one of the drugs, including lenvatinib?
So patients who have high bilirubin will have a very poor response. Their tolerance to the drug will be very poor. So with the lenvatinib induced specific side effect will not lead to a rise in bilirubin. So you have to rule out other issues like a central tumor which might be compressing on the bile duct, which might be responsible for this, or a multicentric HCC which has replaced most of the functioning liver tissue, which might be the cause of rising bilirubin or a completely decompensated disease.
So last question from my side, RFA versus microwave ablation. Do you have any experience of microwave ablation in your setup? Do you prefer microwave over RFA with some of the data showing that it takes less time and maybe more effective?
Right. Not very many patients, but our interventional radiologists prefer using microwave ablation when the tumor is beyond, say, 3 centimeters. So a larger tumor, say if you have a 4 centimeter or 5 centimeter tumor and the patient doesn't want to undergo surgery, then the ablative treatment of choice should be microwave rather than RFA. You are able to cover a larger area with microwave.
And what about cryotherapy as a local ablative therapy?
not much experience with that. Although there is a new technique called electroporation, which is being carried out as a form of a trial in PGI Chandigarh. Naveen does it, and the advantage of it is that even if there is the tumor is around a vessel, or if the vessel is coursing through the tumor, or the tumor is behind the vessel will not be affected, and still you can have a ablative effect on the tumor. That's the advantage.
It's more focused and more targeted.
Right.
All right. So I think we had a good attendance, almost 195, and I believe all of them were attentive to your talk. And thank you very much, Kaushal, and we'll come back to you with the next session very soon. Thank you, the team from Matsaki.
Thank you so much, and thanks to NBE and you. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Singh.
Thank you very much, Dr. Arpit, for the presentation, and thank you very much, Dr. Kaushal and Dr. Ashwini Setia for joining. And thank you, Professor Ankit Goenka, for joining.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Singh. Bye-bye. See you next week.